All right, so welcome back to Reading in the Dark in this very bright room.
You know, I'll go to the next room for Lydia.
Please,
I'll drop it in
please,
her
please,
box.
thank you. Okay. And today, if you're listening online, you should have the source sheet on the screen. So this class is dealing with both conflicts and challenges that we find in the text and strategies for coping with them. And the overarching theme is really talking about, as modern readers, what sorts of problems do we encounter that are different from questions that ancient readers might have had, and which questions, like the one we're going to explore today, as pertains to gender, how, as moderns, do we confront the text, and what do we have available to us? What are our options for really making sense of these issues? Just to review a little bit, for those who were here and those who weren't here, last class we talked about the problem of texts that seem to have lost their practical value. And we focused in on the example of Vayikra, and how both, again, in the ancient world, post-Korban Habayit, and certainly today as modern readers, when we encounter Sefer Vayikra, we have a kind of crisis that these texts, these psukim and prakim that are very oriented towards practical matters, how to perform a certain mitzvah that we can no longer perform, what do we do with these texts? Do we read them for their pure academic value? At a certain point that starts to, as we all know, when we get to the Parshiot of Vayikra, it starts to feel a little bit hard to get into it. And we looked at an example from a collection of Midrash from the 5th century called Vayikra Rabbah, which essentially across the board throughout this entire book adopts what I was calling a spiritualizing strategy, which is take these texts, which are highly practical, find in them some kind of abstract idea which can be relevant to a contemporary audience, and really maximize it and breathe lots of air into that, sometimes even one word that's found in the text, and use it to really teach people what's important. So the example that we looked at was an example from the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra, which begins in a seemingly innocuous way, if you remember, right? Vayikra Hashem, I'm probably misquoting, but El Moshe, Vayidaber Elav, Me'ohel Moed Lemor. So we said it really just sounds like God's talking to Moshe, right? And that happens a lot in the Torah. But what the rabbis ended up doing with that pasuk, which is the headliner for all the halachot of a korban olah, they use that as an opportunity to talk about intimacy between God and man. Most specifically in that instance, intimacy between God and Moshe, and what it meant to God, as it were, that Moshe was ready to hear his speech. And if you recall that last midrash that we looked at, Hashem said to Moshe, don't be worried that you're not giving me a present, and all the other Nisi'im are giving me a lovely gift. You're not giving me gold and silver. What you're giving me is your capacity to hear my speech, and that is the greatest gift that a human being can give me. So how does that help us as readers of Vayikra Rabbah? Well, if we're hearing that kind of sermon in a shul, we're not Moshe, and we're not going to hear God's word directly, but it primes us to think about what sorts of gifts of readiness and presence perhaps we could give to God, and how the Torah text could be a conduit for a relationship with God. That's what we looked at last week. What we didn't get a chance to really do, and it's interesting for you guys who weren't here and are just hearing kind of a snippet, I'd love to hear your reactions also. What is that strategy, if you will, if we think of it as a strategy, right, to spiritualize, to take a text and not disregard it, but not read it completely at face value and read it to understand the words themselves or the concepts, but to take a piece of it and to really amplify it? What's gained and what's lost in that strategy, right? First of all, where else do we see that happening? Do you see teachers, rabbis, yourselves read the Torah in that kind of way? Yes. So, for example, where do you see that?
Like ayin tachat ayin. Like when we're not going to, and I don't know if they ever did, do ayin tachat ayin, but you use it symbolically to represent how a punishment would be, but you're not actually going to take out.
Okay, good. That's an interesting example, because that, when you're dealing with, it's also law, you're right, so it's very similar, but they're taking a legal expression which might have meant something in one context and actually saying, read it in another way, which could teach us a value. Yeah, I like that. That's good. Yeah. What's different about that example is that, just to be very specific, in Vayikra Rabbah, what we saw is that there'll be, let's say, 40 psukim, and the rabbis only relate to one and use that as the basis. Whereas this is a strategy for this pasuk, and it's complete. It doesn't sideline anything else. It rereads, though, in the same kind of way, giving us spiritual meaning to a legal text that, in this case, wouldn't be irrelevant, but is too harsh, right? Or just doesn't really sit well. That's going to be a question we're going to deal with next week, which is when we get to theological problems in the text. Now, that's more about justice. But what are the strategies that we've seen for confronting a theological problem? What's really interesting about the Vayikra strategy, which I don't think that our rabbis do enough of when it comes to the Parsha of Vayikra, right? What's really interesting is that it does make you rethink these texts and say, what I thought couldn't tell me anything because I can't do them, actually can tell me something very deep. And we need, I think, a bit more of that, of saying, okay, this is what we've got. This is all we've got when it comes to communication with God, is this Torah. And so we need to bring new eyes and new ways of reading so that we can find more direction, maybe, or more information about what it means to be in relationship with God, even when the texts seem unyielding, because they're talking about one thing that I can't do. Like Rabbi says, really? That's it? You can only read it in that way? You can only be talking about that korban? Now, of course, what's lost, what's difficult about this approach? How do you know when you've gone too far? Right? How do you know when you've spiritualized beyond the original sense and now you really barely even have the text left? If I only taught you Vayikra Rabbah and I never exposed you to Sefer Vayikra, you wouldn't have a good sense of what's in the book, right? Now, can we afford that?
Sometimes.
Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? And what the conversation we started this class with was, why do we learn Tanakh in the first place? And we kind of organized, I think it was 7 different possible answers for what motivates us to be here in this room, right? Is it searching for the truth? Is it trying to interact with God's word? Is it because it's a mitzvah? Is it because we're intellectually challenged by it? Is it, I actually wrote them down, because we are connecting ourselves to our people? Is it because it's a handmaiden to Torah Sheba'al Peh? Is it because it's interesting, right? Many different possible orientations, and depending on what you're looking to do, what's gained or what's lost will be affected by what your original goal was. Today I want to take us somewhere different. Today I want to talk about gender. And I want to talk at first in kind of general terms, and then we're going to get specific and look again at an example. What happens when we as, and I'm making some assumptions here, but as we're 21st century women, we belong in some capacity to the modern Orthodox community, our understanding of gender looks different than many things we see in the Torah text, right? The ways in which we operate as women in the world and the ways in which we advance gender equality in one way or another in our workplace, in our family life, in our shul life, finds challenges when we read the Tanakh. Right? Can we all agree? Yes. I'm not saying something strange. The question is, what's open to us? What do we do? How have we dealt with this, and what can we use in order to read the Tanakh? So first I want to do a little bit of, I'm going to share, I think, some strategies that I've been involved in, that I've been taught to me, that I've taught, and then I want to hear if you've heard other approaches that have worked for you or not worked for you. So the first thing to notice is what I've just said. I'll just say it again, that we don't generally, or sometimes don't, find echo for our notions of gender equality in the Tanakh. So what do? One strategy is we can start by telling ourselves, and this is really useful up to a point, that the Torah was written at a certain time. We can learn more about that time. We can historicize it, right? We can understand the conditions in which people were living and in which the Torah was given, and we can then tell ourselves, all right, what seems to be really different from our notion of gender isn't all that different if we take into account the time in which the Torah was given. So one great example of this, which you may be familiar with, it's both about strategies for reading the Torah and in the Gemara. Judith Houtman has this wonderful article where she talks about the laws of Sota. Right? And the laws of Sota, the first time you encounter this, and I just had this recently telling a class about it, they had never heard of Sota, which gets to the second strategy we're going to talk about. But she argues that although when you learn the laws of Sota, you're sort of horrified when you find out that a woman could be in public display and have her body distorted, and all because her husband was suspicious. And Judith Hellman argues that in fact, you're nodding, maybe you know this, right?
No,
Okay,
no, yeah, no.
that in fact the genius of sota, if you contextualize it, is that in that world, in the ancient world, if a husband was suspicious of his wife, all he had to do was say the word, and she could be killed. In fact, we have an example of it in the Torah, where it almost happened, in the story of Tamar and Yehuda. When, right, the story, this is again another strategy that stories are usually skipped, but in that story, when she finally confronts, before she confronts Yehuda, it's because he found out that she was pregnant, and he assumed, right, she was part of his family. She wasn't allowed to get married on her own. How could she have gotten pregnant? She must have gone outside of the strictures of the arrangement. And he says, Hotzi'uha, like take her out and burn her. And then Tamar, on her way, says, oh, just can you drop these off at the owner? Right? And those, of course, are the three objects, which were his. And then everything becomes clear to him, and he says, Tzadka mimeni. It's a great story. We love it on some level, right? But that story actually shows what Judith Hellman was talking about, that a man could do that. Sota says, no, you don't have that ability to just act on your whim. If you're suspicious of your wife, there's a procedure, and it has to take place in the public square, because it removes the responsibility and actually the ability on the part of the man to take matters into his own hands. Now everybody can control it. Now it takes place in front of the Kohen. Now there is, right, surveillance. It's wonderful. And it makes you rethink the entire mitzvah. It makes you rethink those psukim, and especially the way that the rabbis interpret it in the Bible. So that's one strategy, right? It's really useful. And in fact, it's very important, and I talk about this with my students all the time. It's important to understand the historical setting of the Torah, but there are limitations. Second strategy. We can ignore the stories that we don't like, right? We can not pretend they're not there, but just not talk about them too much, not upplay them, right? We don't need to, if I'm giving a bar mitzvah speech, I don't need to talk about the rape of Dinah. I don't need to go there, right? I don't need to talk about the story of Tamar being raped by her brother and David HaMelech not saying anything. I don't need to go to the story of the concubine being cut up. There are a lot of stories that are terrible in the Tanakh from all kinds of ways. We know they're there. We study them. We don't need to upplay them. Okay, that's kind of a strategy, and it's something that we see in our educational decisions. Not here, we don't skip, but it's certainly right in elementary school, and at times it's appropriate. The flip side of that is to upplay the stories that we do like. So, what girl doesn't know the story of Devorah? And I think about many years ago when I wrote a curriculum for JOFA, it was geared towards the 5th grade, and the commission was write a gender-sensitive curriculum about Shmot for the 5th grade. And it was meant to be supplementary. It was not going to, clearly 5th grade teachers have it together. This was give them tools for really finding more moments to talk about women and gender in the text. And so we wrote 10 units that all dealt with the beginning of Shmot, because that's where the women cluster, the midwives, Miriam, Yocheved. And in fact, in this room, I gave a class a few years ago that was all about women in the Shmot story, women in leadership. We love to talk about it. It's wonderful, right? And we feel we can learn from their lessons, and we can actually maybe not do like them. Remember the Midrash we studied about the women in the mirrors, right? We're not right about seducing their husbands and teaching them to see themselves as human beings. I love teaching that because I can talk about what women's leadership can look like and what lessons we can draw from them. In that JOFA curriculum, I remember one of the problems, when you really kind of upplay the women, you run into the problem that you end up essentializing. So women in that story are the leaders and the men are the schlubs. And I remember being nervous for the boys in the classroom when we were piloting it, because suddenly the boys were shrinking. The men, Amram couldn't see things clearly. His little daughter had to come in and say, Abba, get back with Ima, because, right, we need you together. And he, the father, who was the leader, turned out to not look so great. So there's a danger to that strategy as well. So we have upplaying, we have downplaying, and we have historicizing. What other strategies have you yourselves used in your study of Tanakh or in classes that you've attended? What would you say is the approach to reading texts in the Tanakh that talk specifically about gender and women. How have they been taught to you, or how have you managed it when you've read a story or a text that doesn't seem to jive with how you see things today? Any ideas? I'm asking you to like uncover what you do and be reflective about it, which is hard.
I think we've all said it was a patriarchal orientation, period.
So mostly the historicizing
Yeah.
part, right? And sometimes, in fact, and I think that was more first wave we're going to see in a moment, of really calling attention to it. Like in our classes, let's study the patriarchal elements of the Tanakh. We don't really do that anymore because we know it. It's been exposed. That was the first wave of feminist thought, which began to say, wait a second, this isn't just how it is. This is reflecting a certain kind of value system, and we're going to really point out and expose all those fault lines in the text. But once you've done that, then what? So you either walk away because you say, I can't read this, or you're left feeling out of sorts. Yeah.
Just to expand on what Malka said, Adrisha Rabbi Silber has often taught, and I'm sure you learned, that he always sees that people on the margins often see more clearly than the people who actually have the power. And since, like you said, it was a patriarchal society, very often it was the women who were on the margins, didn't have the power. But in a lot of these stories in Tanakh, they have influence. Even if they don't have power, they have the insight and they can influence things. And very often these stories show women not in a position of power, but in a position of influence. And they can make things happen, but they often have to be creative in how they make things happen.
So what strategy is that? What Rabbi Silber does?
Rationalization.
Well, that's the cynical view,
Or
right?
contextualization.
Contextualization, but actually what he's doing, I think, in those shiurim, and yes, I'm a student of Rabbi Silber, he is saying, okay, let's call attention to gender, but let's really use it to talk about power. Those shiurim end up saying people in the margins in general. Happens to be that in the Torah, a lot of times people on the margins are women, but that's not the only way you can be on the margins. And the Torah is celebrating the power of people on the margins.
Right.
So he actually ends up, on some level, first of all, turning the Torah into a feminist text, right? Because it's singing our song. We're on the same team. And it's also using gender, and this is the really helpful part, he's using gender as a lens to really talk about issues that both affect women and affect everyone. Right? In gender studies, the first step is really talking about women, and then the second step is, okay, we're not just interested in women, we're interested in society, and we want to understand how gender constructs affect everybody. The problem is what happens when you read texts that don't seem to support that view, where the people on the margins are not the leaders, and they're really only the victims. I'm thinking of, let's say, and Rabbi Silber teaches beautifully about this, but the story of Lot and his daughters. Right? When he's willing at that moment when the strangers come to the door and they say, bring out the men, and he says, here's my daughters. Right? And they don't win at all in that story. Right? And they're silenced, and we only imagine their cries, and there's nothing redeeming about that moment. On that very depressing note, let's look at what I would suggest on some level is kind of the core of things, and it's the beginning of Breshit. Let's look at the first 3 chapters of Breshit. This is where everything gets laid out for us for the first time, as it were. And we're going to see, number 1, what does Breshit Aleph through Gimel have to say about gender? What comes up for us? And along the way, because I can't help it, we're not just going to be noticing things, I'm also going to be advancing a certain kind of reading. Okay, so I'm trying to navigate that. Let's read together these prakim, but in the end, I want us to be able to say something redemptive that will be a kind of strategy in understanding how gender plays itself out. So what I have here on the sheet is just a little bit from Perek Aleph, a little more from Perek Bet, and then all of Perek Gimel. We're not going to read all of Perek Gimel. But let's start at the very beginning, okay? Perek Aleph chapter 1, Genesis. You know, and I'm living Genesis this year because I teach it to the 12th grade. So I'm keeping that in mind. You're not living Genesis in the same way. But and I find this every year in the 12th grade, right? Kids learn Bereshit for the first time since 3rd grade, right? They kind of missed it that the story of creation is told twice. Now, I watch my kids when they're little. They learn it. They get it. They see that. It's pointed out to them. It's not the teachers do a great job. But what ends up being really strong for them is chapter 1, the days, because they do those wonderful dioramas and now videos, and right, to understand that time was created in chapter 1, and God created something different on each day. But the story they remember about men and women is Parak Bet. Now, what do I mean? Okay, in chapter 1, if you see here, chapter 1, I only gave the psukim that have to do with the creation of people. But we all know the first part, and that's the days, and at the end of every day it says Vahi Erev Vahi Voker, right, in the name of the number of the day, and God says after God creates each thing that it's good. And then we'll get to the psukim which come right before this when God says, let's make man. Right? And for another class we could talk about that very interesting expression, which is deviation from the pattern in Parak Aleph, where God speaks in the plural. Let us make man, right? And let's make man in our image. In Pasuk of Zion, in verse 27 and then in 28, and this is typical in chapter 1, first God says, let's do this, or let the following thing happen, and then the text reports on it happening. So in the reporting part, 27 and 28, Vayivra Elokim et ha'adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elokim bara oto, zachar unekeva bara otam. Very repetitive, even if you understood nothing. Lots of words sound the same. Look in the English for a moment. And God created man. Now, man there is a translation for the word ha-adam. Typically, man is Adam, right? But here, in the first mention, it's ha-adam. And then the pasuk comes back. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So there's a him that's a them, an oto that's an otam, right? The ha-adam, this first human creature, is actually both male and female, right? And you can go the route of some early midrashim, and also Plato says something similar, that what's being described here is some kind of, two-gendered, two-faced, androgynous, something or other creature. Or you could say human beings were created at the same time, zachar nekeva. Right? There's humanity is being described here. It's not getting into the details of bodies, but humanity is being described here, and there's two salient features. One is Zachar Nekeva, and the first is Tselem Elokim, right? Image of God. Now, what does that really mean, image of God? We don't know. But what we say about Tselem Elokim, what people have said compellingly, is that image of God means the intellectual capacity, the creative capacity, everything that's been described about God up until now in chapter 1, which is God's ability to use speech to create worlds. We can also use speech to create worlds, just not the celestial kind or the tree kind or right? We use our words all the time in creating worlds, and we use our minds and our creativity in order to create change in the world. So we are created in that image, B'Tselem Elokim. So what's really important, and I, again, impress this upon my students when they see this, Zachar unekeva are created b'tzelem Elokim. There's no such thing as men are created in the image of God and women are something else. It's really, really clear in this pasuk, right? And people have said, if you would kind of line up those three phrases, and God created man in his image, in the image of God, male and female, they're each kind of, the second two phrases, rather, are interpretations of the first. So what is Salmo, Tselem Shelhu? God, right? Who's the Oto? The Oto is the Otam. And the Zachar and Nekeva are created B'Tselem Elokim. You see that?
But it is weird. He should have said Tselem Elokim bara otam.
Yeah.
Unless the Oto is not what we want, our instinct is that the Oto is really Adam, and then Otam is both. The Oto is the Adam creature, meaning in this pasuk, and it gets trippy if you try to put this on as a play. But the Oto is not referring to one body. The oto is humanity,
Humanity.
right? So humanity is made up of zachar and nekeva. Everything's happening all at
One would
once.
wonder why it has to be so ambiguous.
Right.
What purpose that serves.
Any ideas why is this pasuk written in this way? First of all, it's like poetry, right? Of sorts. But it reminds me, a student in the 12th grade yesterday said about Paragimel, exactly your question. Why is the Torah so ambiguous? If you're telling me it's so important, and this is a text I gotta live by, and it connects me to God, why can't it be more clear? Why are there so many possibilities? I'm uncomfortable with that, right? So what do you say to that? What do we do with the ambiguity? It's a good commercial break. Why is the Torah written in such what feels to us like ambiguous terms? Why is there so much opportunity for possible readings and new ideas, and you say this and I say that, and I can find support and you find support?
If the material which is ambiguous is the opportunity for creativity to make it pertinent for every generation and time, that would be fine. But where it's ambiguous is often the very place where we're not supposed to have ambiguity in major values.
Like what? Give me an example.
Not thinking, I don't like that thing going.
Nobody sees you.
I don't know, I'm not thinking of anything. I just remember feeling so many times, hello, this is important. This is not something that's an opinion.
Right,
And if it's not an opinion, and then be straight.
right. So one thing I will say, but we will come back to this again and again in the next few weeks, because that's really the essential question.
It is.
Everything else we discuss is basically a way into that question. And one thing that helps me, again, coming back to why we study Tanakh, understanding the Torah as a divine text means that it necessarily has to have either ambiguity or layeredness to it. Meaning, if this was a text that could be completely understood by human beings, written in the way that we communicate to each other, so I would read it, I would get it, and I would put it on a shelf. I would be done with it, right? To give a very extreme example, I read, a letter from the school about dismissal procedures, or I get it. I don't need to read it again. I understood it. The Torah is never that way, and the Torah, in its necessity to read and reread and reinterpret and see different things in it each time you come, it gives us an opportunity to understand what divine speech is. Saying that out loud, you're saying that sounds nice. I don't know what you mean.
No, I'm saying that within stories,
Mm-hmm.
and especially Breshit, finding values along the way, I think is fine. Then when it comes to out and out laws, it's not a time for ambiguity, and some of them they're very clear, don't murder. They're very clear, don't steal, and they were probably clear, a woman shouldn't be a witness, a woman a man can divorce a woman. These are laws. This is, I don't know.
Right, so when it comes to the legal texts of the Torah and how they get understood in terms of policy, it is a separate question, because we have, and we can talk about this, with Midrash Halacha and eventually crystallizing into the way that the Gemara reads it, the verses really don't become any more open to possibilities. Meaning nobody today will say, I can do something, or I see room halachically because the pasuk says this. The psukim are no longer. Right, in terms of legal import, there's a tradition of how to read them, and at a certain point the psukim are not fair game anymore. That is not the same for Agadah, as you pointed out. So we are limiting ourselves right now for the time being in Agadah, but I would love to talk about the Midrash Halacha tradition. Okay, we've read one pasuk. Let's look a little bit more. So what comes next? Vayivarech otam Elokim, vayomer lahem Elokim, pru urvu umilu et haaretz v'chivshuha, uredu bidgat hayam uva'of hashamayim, uva'chol chaya haromeset al haaretz. So after this moment of reporting on this he, she, them creature was created that was reflective of God's image, God turns to them and blesses them and says, this is what you should do. This is your command, really, more than a blessing in the way we think of a blessing. You should be fertile. You should increase on the earth. Kiv shuha, right? Master it, take control of it, and rule over the other creatures. And you notice that each of these verbs is in the plural, although we know, and Malka, as to your question, right, in terms of halacha, pru'ervu, technically obligation only falls on men, which is technical only, right, clearly. Here, in its original sense, it was for both zachar and nekeva together. This is a joint project. You share the same responsibilities. You actually need each other, at least for pru'ervu, and assumedly for everything in this pasuk. Zachar and nekeva together are working to bring to actuality God's image on the earth. Now, and I joke about this, if I wanted to, let's say, give a class in gender values in Breshit, I would only read Perek Aleph. I'm good. This works. Tzelem Elokim, at our core, when we're not talking about our biological functions, right, because you can't get around that, but at our core, what it means to be a human being is to try to be like God of this earth. And that is not gendered. In fact, if I wanted to do my own midrashic reading on this, I would say the definition of Tzelem Elokim is holding both your zachar side and your nekeva side. That's what it means to be a full human being. We all have it in one way or another, right? Whatever we get, whatever society calls masculine and feminine, we all have those impulses and characteristics, and to hold them both and to honor them both and actualize, that's what it means to be B'Tselem Elokim. Okay, but that's me. That's on this side. But we don't just have Perek Aleph, we have Perek Bet. So what do we do with Perek Bet? All right, I want to just point out a few things. If you look in Perek Bet, right, so just to refresh, Perek Aleph ends, and it creeps a little bit into Perek Bet. We have the Psukim of Shabbat. And then, as it were, the story starts again. But the story is told totally differently. And there's no days, and there's no order, and there's no rhyme and symmetry like there was in Perek Aleph. And in Perek Bet, the story is really only focusing in on the creation of human beings, and whatever information is necessary in order to set up the stage is told to us in Perek Bet. But the real scene, the real action, is in the slowed down version of creating man and woman. Now, even just saying what I just said, the slowed down version, that is a strategy for understanding Aleph and Bet together. What do I mean? Most of the Parshanim say, all right, Perek Aleph seems to say this about man and woman. Together, Tzelem Elokim, no differentiation. Perek Bet, as we know, says something very different. How do we resolve them? Well, Perek Aleph is the general story, and Perek Bet is the more slowed down story with more details. No real conflict. Now, that's hard to accept because there are conflicts that don't go away even when you give that overarching structure. And you know, in 12th grade, one of the things we do is we read Rav Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith, where he essentially is offering religious critique of American Jewish community. But he does that via reading the first 2 chapters of Genesis and saying that you really can't resolve away the differences. The differences are really, really strong, and they point towards 2 different impulses in a human being. So he's giving his perush on these prakim, but he's really taking us somewhere else. So what is the pshat of Perek Bet? After God creates man, he puts him in Gan Eden, and the Psukim describe Gan Eden to us. And then he's given the command, right? I'm looking here in verse 16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. The Lord God said, it is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. Let's just look at the Hebrew. That is Pasuk Yud Chet rather. Vayomer Hashem Elokim lo tov heyot Adam levado e'aseh lo ezer kenegdo. Right, that word tov, which had been so important in chapter 1 to signify when God said some certain creation was complete and done, he says about man, it's not tov. It's not good for ha'adam, by the way, same expression, to be on his own. I will make him an ezer kenegdo. Now, so much ink has been spilled on ezer kenegdo. We're not going to get into it, only to say that it's somewhat ambiguous. It sounds like an ezer, well, how does he translate it? A helper, an ezer, la'azor, to help. Kenegdo. Kenegdo means really
In opposition.
either against or really just opposite in the sense of geographical opposite, right? Next to. An Azer next to him, or as Rashi says, you were all raised on this Rashi, but an Azer kenegdo. He will be an Azer, she'll be an Azer to you if God's in the relationship, if things work. If not, she will be against you, right? Really setting up man and woman as either complementary or oppositional. But Azer kenegdo sounds like some kind of, right? You can't be by yourself. You need somebody next to you. You need an Azer, somebody to do it with you. So woman is created not in Parak Aleph at the same time, but woman's created secondarily, and she's created to fill a need that man can't do it on his own. Again, lots of ways to read that. And then God puts Adam in the position of realizing himself that he doesn't have an Azer. Instead of just rushing from Pasuk Yudchet to creating woman, first he brings the animals in front of him and tells him to give the animal a name. And through the process of naming in verse 20, and the man gave names to all the cattle and to all the birds of the sky and to all the wild beasts. But for Adam, no fitting helper was found. Right? Many Parshanim have argued what this is about is Adam realizing through that process of each animal coming forward with its pair, or in a very kind of extreme reading, and the kids love this one, but that somehow he actually tried to copulate with each animal and then realized at the end, this isn't going to work, I don't have my Azer. After that experience, whether it's just the naming and the noticing or actually looking for a mate, he realizes, I'm all on my own here. Everyone else has their pair and I don't. Then God puts him to sleep, right, and creates woman. So there is a recognition on Adam's part of his lacking and his need for a companion. And then when she is created, again, of course, out of his body, God brings the woman to the man. And in verse 23, he says, and this is definitely poetry, the way that the JPS translates it and puts it in those short lines, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man she was taken. Right? This Adam who has been silent up until now, although he gave names, we don't hear them. He has been a kind of mute creature. Suddenly when woman is there, he jumps into this beautiful poetry where he says, now again, you could say beautiful or you could say not so beautiful, Zot hapa'am, this time, as opposed to all the other times when I saw those creatures and they weren't like me, this time she is of my bones and of my flesh. We're together. We're of the same stuff. Lazoti kare isha, I will call this one Isha because she was taken from Ish. So notice, by the way, he becomes Ish only when there's Isha. He notices who he is only in reference to Isha. Only when there's differentiation is there self on some level. Right? Now, of course, that word zot is very disturbing. Zot, because it sounds like he's kind of pointing at her. There could be a sort of objectification going on here. The zot to this one as opposed to the others, but the students are always very uncomfortable with that word. And then the kind of narrative there ends, or it's interrupted by us being told, now this is what will happen from now on, that a man will leave the comfort of his parents. Of course, Adam doesn't have parents, but modeling forward, leaving the original place and clinging to one's wife. V'hayu lebasar echad. From now on, people will become like one flesh together, echoing the basar mi bsari. So Parak Bet, right? If Parak Aleph had talked about what it means to be together in this world, means to kind of be creative, be a force in the world, move things forward, echo God, Parak Bet is more about relationships, right? And so they find each other, really, he finds her, and he sees who she is, and then sees who he is. And they are together, they form this kind of oneness out of separateness. And the parak ends, Vayhu shnehem aromim, Adam v'ishto, v'lo yishboshashu. And the two of them were naked, the shnehem, this kind of, they're together in this again, where we started in Parak Aleph, they're now on equal footing on some level. They were naked and they weren't embarrassed, which of course is a setup for chapter 3. Right? We're being told about their lack of embarrassment because that will all change in chapter 3. All right, let's just stop here for a moment. What have you noticed? If, again, we're trying to, and I may not have been doing such a great job of navigating, just reading without offering an interpretation, what do you notice about gender in chapter 1 and chapter 2? Or what bothers you? Think back to our opening question. What do we do when we read these texts? What's available to us? Is this easy to read? It's hard to even maybe dislodge because you've read it so many times and you know it so well, right? What jumps out at you if you were teaching this to people who have never studied the Bible before and live in your world? Is there a sense of continuity? Is there a sense of discomfort?
Well, you're getting a different story.
What do you
In the
mean?
beginning it says that God created humanity, male, comma, female,
Mm-hmm.
in his image.
Mhm.
And then the next thing is, so let me tell you how this all happened. There were animals, and then he created man.
So you
And
would
out of him came a woman. It would be like, what are you talking about? You just said they were created together.
so contradictions.
Yeah.
Yes. Pick a side. Okay. Now, can you read? Perek Bet is fairly open to interpretation in the sense that Perek Aleph is very clear, right? Together, equal, Salam Elohim. Perek Bet. Now, being created second and being created out of man's body, does that necessarily tell you about the woman's value or the woman's worth? Does it necessarily tell you what the Torah thinks about men and women? Like, can we step back for a
It's
moment?
a little implied, yeah,
What is implied?
that they weren't created at the same time.
So what? Why is not
I was
created
gonna
at the
say,
same
I
time?
think that, I think that there's a lot of, I think we're all biased, and I think a lot of the bias comes from really the Christian interpretation of the Bible that sort of is just so out there and so prevalent that we've all been influenced by it before we even, like, I didn't even learn Bereshit in my elementary school. We started at Lech Lecha, because that way it was, and it was Rav Soloveitchik's school, you know, it was Maimonides, and because he felt it was so difficult, these early passages and stories, and how day and night and light and sun and moon and what does it all mean. So we started at a very concrete story. So, but yet I've heard all this, you know, and I think it's just being out there and with the way that Christians have interpreted the Bible, and they've made it a very patriarchal system, you know, and that's what they've stressed, you know, the man is the ruler of the household and things like that, that I think because of that, we might have a very negative connotation to all of this. Because when you look at it right now, which I'm doing, it doesn't have to be like, oh yeah, she's like so minor, she's just a piece of his rib. You know what I mean? Like, why did it take such a negative connotation? But it has. Like, whenever anyone learns that story, all the boys sort of snicker, you know, and all the girls sort of feel bad. And why is that? It doesn't have to be. And I think it's really because of the interpretations that have been out there. And some of them, I'm sure, are our own midrashim, but I'm saying it's not inherent in the word, in the Hebrew words. Right? You understand? Like, because even in like in Aleph, ha'adam, so we're saying it means, you know, mankind, you know, vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, but, you know, it could mean humanity. He creates humanity in his, you know, and if you use it as the general word, then it almost isn't difficult. It's very,
Well, that pasuk isn't
you know,
the one that brings difficulty.
no, but there could be, you know, people could say, oh, you know, like Adam is man, but maybe
Right.
Adam isn't man. Maybe Adam is just humanity
But
all
then
the
you
time.
go back to that question about why the ambiguity? I mean, why in something like this, which is so critical, why can't
Why
it
is
be
there
more clear?
contrary information?
Because you
Next
know what? I don't
question.
know what. I mean, this is going to sound terrible, but does it matter if it's so clear? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what is it going to change?
Because it has an
You know?
implication. If one is born first, even if you're twins, the one who's 2 seconds older is very proud to be the oldest. It matters, even though
Well, and then you
they're
go back
2
to
seconds
birthrights and
apart.
stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Okay, wait, there's so many interesting things on the table. This is wonderful. I want to respond to what you just said first and then come back to what you said. This is not about birth order, because one could make the total contrary argument. Again, we have to ask ourselves why we're doing this. But you could say that, on the other hand, man was created first. He wasn't really okay on his own. There was something lacking in him, and being created second means, as a second child, right? Parents get it better the second time, if we want to go the birth argument, right? There's a certain kind of, sorry to my sister, but there's a sense here possibly that Isha is actually an improvement. Why? Well, you're pointing out, okay, and this relates and doesn't relate, in the sense that could we read this text without all of the ways
Right.
we've always been told to read it? And if we could, which we really can't, but if we could free ourselves
We
in
could,
American,
we could try.
Western civilization from the Christian reading, right? And I think
Right.
your point is very well taken. As Jews, and this has been a curricular choice, but it also impacts on how we understand these, we start with Lech Lecha. These prakim have not had as nearly as much of an impact on our thinking as Lech Lecha and onwards. But this is our stuff too. So how can we claim it? And if we are reading it for gender attitudes, right? And if the Torah is telling me about myself, I want to know what are all my options. So I agree with you, and I don't think Perek Bet is negative.
Right, like it's time for women to sort of set the tone themselves. You know, like we're always sort of reactionary, but it set the tone. There's nothing wrong with being made from the rib. You know what I mean? Like don't. I would like just an example sort of went through my mind and I lost it. Of just in life, how you sort of you let the it's time for women even embrace you to seize the head of the conversation. Do you know what I'm saying? Look at it a different way as opposed to always being reactionary.
But I think Malka, and I'm going to put words into your mouth, but I think Malka would say, just be careful and don't offer me an apology. I don't want apologetics.
No.
I want to understand this, and I want to know what's available here. And you're right. If women are having the conversation and we're coming at it with an openness, and we want to see what's here and we want to see what's available to us, then we will be hopefully seeing things clearly. Right? But listen, we're all culture, we're all
But
products.
is it just a coincidence then that for thousands of years it's been seen one way?
Well, the strong
And now
people
we're
always write the history. It's like the history's always written by the victors. You know what I'm saying? It's
So that's the
who were learning,
feel
who
of
were
the
yeshivas,
apologetics.
who were.
That's the
But it's not
feel.
apologetics. It's just the way things have always been. And now that there's women's institutes, in the last 50, 100 years. I mean, time's progressing. Women have their own institutions. They are learning. It's a very different world than 500, 1,000, 2,000 years ago.
Ever.
Right. You understand what I'm saying? It's like it's almost a different time in Jewish learning.
All right, I have an idea. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to just put a little bit more out on the table in terms of the text.
Mhm.
I knew we couldn't finish this in 1 week, and that's fine. But I want to put a little more evidence, a little bit to what you're speaking of in terms of how, is it a coincidence, or how have we gotten to this place, and offering really a very different take on this story. Okay? So we don't have time to read Perek Gimel, but I just want to point out a few important questions that are on the table. Now, Perek Gimel is in many ways a continuation of Perek Bet. Never mind what we said at the end about the nakedness and the lack of embarrassment. That was a setup for Perek Gimel. If we had more time, we could see some of the other parallels that really show you that we're continuing in that story. And we know what happens, although if we read it again, we might see it differently. But we know what happens with the sin, the quote-unquote sin, right, which many have argued now is really not a sin at all. This is a description of what it means to be a human being and to possess free will, and what it means to have reason and to live with the limitations of our reason. But if we look at what happens in the aftermath, okay? In the aftermath, after God turns to this man and his wife, who, by the way, for the first time, hear God's voice, okay? And we're told, the irony, once they've disobeyed God, right, then they notice that they're naked, whatever that means, both symbolically and literally, and they hide themselves, and then they hear God's voice, right? So there is a brokenness, I don't want to say fall, but there's a brokenness that then opens up the possibility of relationship in a different way with God. And God calls to Adam and says, Ayeka, and he gives this kind of convoluted answer, which is also the truth. I heard you, I was afraid, I hid, and then he says, who told you you were naked, right? We know this. When God turns to them and gives them the punishments, what's really fascinating about the punishments is that each of them, although they're different, they each have a common thread. Each of them essentially redirects or reverses a relationship that the character had with something else before Perek Gimel. So in the case of the Nachash, we're introduced to the Nachash that he was the most clever of all the animals, right? And so he saw himself as really on a different plane. His curse is that now he will be the most downtrodden of all the animals. He thought he was on equal footing with people, which is why, right, he was speaking and trying to seduce and tempt Isha. Afterwards, he is really, right, always going to be now in this battle with human beings, there will be a mutual enmity between the two of them. Skipping Isha for a moment. If we look at Ish before, right, Adam, in the beginning of Perek Gimel and certainly in Perek Bet, he was set up as living in Gan Eden in a kind of harmony with the Adamah. His job was to conquer the world and to rule over the animals, but in terms of the land, right, his job was really just kind of like pruning, gardening. He had this, the land was easily going to give him what he needed, and he was Gan Eden, literally paradise. He was going to be able to just easily get what he needed. As a result of Perek Gimel, he has this reversal, and now he's going to have a very hard time getting what he needs from the land, and living in a moment and an era of dislocation and misalignment, as it were, between Adam and Adamah. And then if we look at Isha is the most complicated because there's really two components to her punishment. One is, as we know, pain in childbirth and everything that goes with it. And number two, her relationship with Ish is going to be irrevocably changed. Totally not clear, and it's fascinating how many possible ways there are to read this, although we all know the most common reading. But in the Hebrew, her punishment is ve'elishech chukatech v'hu yimshol bach. You will desire your husband, but he will rule over you. Now, what's fascinating about this punishment and how it's been read, again, it has been used as a justification for misogyny. It has been used as a justification for silencing women. And on my last test in the 12th grade, I gave them about 10 different readings from the ancient world to the contemporary world of, I would say, misuses of Perek Gimel, and asked them to show me in which ways these thinkers deviated from the pshat. Because it's really easy to pull out a pasuk and use that as your basis for a certain kind of social platform, political platform. We see it all the time. I want to just show you here in sources 4, 5, and 6, I brought you different readings of the punishments. Simone de Beauvoir as the second sex, right, 1949. We're going to call this first wave feminism. Malka, do you want to read?
Eve was not fashioned at the same time as the man. She was not fabricated from a different substance, nor of the same clay as was used to model Adam. She was taken from the flank of the first male. Not even her birth was independent. God did not spontaneously choose to create her as an end in itself, and in order to be worshipped directly by her in return for it. She was destined by him for man. It was to rescue Adam from loneliness that he gave her to him. In her mate was her origin and her purpose. She was his complement on the order of the inessential. Thus she appeared in the guise of privileged prey. She was nature elevated to transparency of consciousness. She was a conscious being, but naturally submissive. And therein lies the wondrous hope that man had often put in woman. He hopes to fulfill himself as a being by carnally possessing a being, but at the same time confirming his sense of freedom through the docility of a free person. No man would consent to be a woman, and every man wants women to exist.
Okay, I asked you to read this because this is essentially, right, what you were talking about earlier, which is first wave feminism, pointing out the patriarchal roots and the ways that the Bible has been used to support patriarchy, right? And she reads Perek Bet in that way, right? She's second, she's from his body, she's certainly only oriented towards him, her whole life is revolving around him.
His loneliness.
Right, exactly, and who wouldn't want this? Wish fulfillment. Okay. Number 2, Phyllis Tribble, who is a Christian theologian who kind of goes in the opposite direction, who says, instead of finding the roots of patriarchy, let's actually reread, almost like Rabbi Silber, right, and finding in the text our song. She says, the women's movement errs when it dismisses the Bible as inconsequential or condemns it as enslaving. In rejecting Scripture, women ironically accept male chauvinistic interpretations and thereby capitulate to the very view they are protesting. But there is another way, to reread, not rewrite the Bible without the blinders of Israelite men or of Paul, Barth, Bonhoeffer, and a host of others. The hermeneutical challenge is to translate biblical faith without sexism. This statement that the husband rule over his wife is not license for male supremacy, but rather it is condemnation of that very pattern. Subjugation and supremacy are perversions of creation. What Tribble is arguing, and Leon Cass, who maybe we'll read it more closely next time, I just want to leave you with his idea. He argues that instead of reading the punishment as prescriptive, this is how things shall be. God is now saying in Perek Gimel, from now on, men will rule over women. What God is actually saying in Perek Gimel is he's predicting the course of human history. Now, why is human history going to move towards men ruling over women? As Cass says, the new information they have after Perek Gimel is the fact of maternity. What does that mean? Perek Aleph already said Pru Urvu. They already knew that this was their plan, right? But they didn't know it until after Perek Gimel. Now, the fact of maternity, says Leon Cass, spells a lot of changes, as it were, or explains a lot of how we operate in society. Why? Well, women, because human beings use their reason and are smarter than the other creatures, we have bigger heads. Because we have bigger heads, giving birth hurts. Because in the ancient world, okay, I'm putting a lot of things out here that he says very clearly, because in the ancient world women could not prove the paternity of the child, there was an underlying anxiety that the man who had gotten her pregnant would abandon her. And so women developed, not in any kind of conscious way, but they did develop mechanisms for encouraging the men to stick around. And one of the important mechanisms was to give men control. So they would feel like they had a kind of, fiefdom, but a place where they were needed and where they could exert their power. Men, in connection with this, had their anxiety that women's sexuality could go unchecked, and they would then end up taking care of kids that weren't their own. And so a lot of society, a lot of social rules developed around limiting female sexuality so that the family could be preserved. Leon Cass says what Perek Gimel is telling us, it's kind of predicting the long view of how things will or did inevitably end up flowing out of that new fact of maternity, right? The fact that only women can give birth in a relationship. Man knows it now, women knows it now, and they're being given a sense of what will happen out of that. What's the point of all of it? Not to say, okay, so it makes a lot of sense then if men end up controlling women, like Phyllis Tribble says, as a kind of warning. This stuff needs to happen, but it's not a license for control. It's not a license for power. What's all of the rest of Breshit constantly telling you where power can go out of control? It can go unchecked. It's a warning. Perek Gimel is saying this is what will happen because of maternity. But A, it's got to be limited, and B, we want to get back to what it was like before the punishments, right? If you look at the Onesh Adam, that he's going to struggle with agriculture. Now, would you ever say that that's like a kiyum, that's a fulfillment if people are terrible farmers and they have no tools and they have no innovations? That's a wonderful thing because God told them it will be difficult for you? No, our job as human beings is to constantly innovate and to try to make it easier and to try to yield more produce, GMOs, and right, all the mechanisms that we have to make it easier for us to live on this earth and to take care of ourselves and our families. Likewise for Onesh Isha. It's not, nobody would say it's a mitzvah not to have an epidural. Nobody would say you're violating God's word. Same with the second part, right? V'hu yimshol bach is not a carte blanche and a confirmation or a support of misogyny. It's a question, and if we want to get back to, ultimately, the more we correct ourselves in our society, we want to get back to the way things were. So, best case scenario, Perek Aleph. If not, Perek Bet, when they were at the end, by Yushnei Hamarami, together, they were partners. There was mutual respect and mutual connection, and the base of society was their relationship with each other and their harmony with their surroundings. So Leon Cass, and I brought the book for you to look at, it's really a very interesting twist, and he's saying, you don't have to do it's not a stretch. This is actually what the text is saying. And how did it happen? A coincidence that people read it that way? Well, he will say, no, that makes a lot of sense because some of the imbalances in society are hinged on the fact of maternity. But that doesn't justify, right? And that doesn't give an extension for the corruption of power, which ultimately stems from the relationship between men and women. All right? Very interesting.
Very interesting. Very good.
Next time, let's leave a little bit of space in the beginning to unpack this, and then we'll go on to a new problem and a new strategy.
Great.
All Right.
Could
Thank
we
you all
take
so
this
much.
or-
Sure,
yeah.
sure, sure.
Okay, just wanna be
Wonderful.
on task.